"There is nothing you can do," said Connolly. "Nothing at all. Why did you have to follow me?" He was standing with his back to Pearson, staring out across the calm blue water that led to Italy. On the left, behind the anchored fishing fleet, the sun was setting, but neither man was even remotely aware of the beauty all around. Pearson rose to his feet and came forward out of the little cafe's shadowed porch into the slanting sunlight. He joined Connolly by the cliff wall, but was careful not to come too close to him. Even in normal times, Connolly disliked being touched. His obsession, whatever it might be, would make him doubly sensitive now. "Listen, Roy," Pearson began urgently. "We've been friends for 20 years, and you ought to know that I wouldn't let you down this time. Besides—" "I know. You promised Ruth." "And why not? After all, she is your wife. She has a right to know what's happened." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's worried, Roy. Much more worried than if it was only another woman." He nearly added the word again, but decided against it. Connolly stubbed out his cigarette on the flat-topped granite wall. "I'm sorry, Jack," he said, and for a moment there was a glimpse of the familiar personality which Pearson knew must be trapped somewhere within the stranger standing at his side. "I know you're trying to be helpful, and I appreciate it, but I wish you hadn't followed me. You'll only make matters worse." "Convince me of that, and I'll go away." Connolly sighed. "I could no more convince you than that psychiatrist you persuaded me to see." "I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not trying to cure you, whatever that means. If you like it the way you are, that's your affair. But I think you ought to let us know what's happened, so that we can make plans accordingly." "To get me certified?" Pearson shrugged his shoulders. He wondered if Connolly could see through his feigned indifference to the real concern he was trying to hide. Now that all other approaches seemed to have failed, the frankly I don't care attitude was the only one left open to him. "I wasn't thinking of that. There are a few practical details to worry about. Do you want to stay here indefinitely? You can't live without money, even on Cyrene." "I can stay at Clifford Rawnsley's villa as long as I like. He was a friend of my father's, you know. It's empty at the moment, except for the servants, and they don't bother me." Connolly turned away from the parapet on which he was resting. "I'm going up the hill before it's dark," he said. The words were abrupt, but Pearson knew that he was not being dismissed. He could follow if he pleased, and the knowledge brought him the first satisfaction he had felt since locating Connolly. It was a small triumph, but he needed it. They did not speak during the climb. Indeed, Pearson scarcely had the breath to do so. Connolly set off at a reckless pace, as if deliberately attempting to exhaust himself. The island fell away beneath them. The white villas gleamed like ghosts in the shadowed valleys. The little fishing boats, their day's work done, lay at rest in the harbour, and all around was the darkling sea. When Pearson caught up with his friend, Connolly was sitting in front of the shrine which the devout islanders had built on Cyrene's highest point. He was breathing heavily from his exertions, yet his features were relaxed, and for the moment he seemed almost at peace. The shadow that lay across his mind had lifted, and he turned to Pearson with a smile that echoed his old infectious grin. "He hates exercise, Jack. It always scares him away." "And who is he?" said Pearson. "Remember, you haven't introduced us yet." Connolly smiled at his friend's attempted humour. Then his face suddenly became grave. "Tell me, Jack," he began, "would you say I have an overdeveloped imagination?" "No. You're about average. You're certainly less imaginative than I am." Connolly nodded slowly. "That's true enough, Jack. And it should help you to believe me, because I'm certain I could never have invented the creature who's haunting me. He really exists. I'm not suffering from paranoiac hallucinations, or whatever Dr. Curtis would call them. You remember Maud White? It all began with her. I met her at one of David Trescott's parties about 6 weeks ago. I'd just quarrelled with Ruth and was rather fed up. We were both pretty tight, and as I was staying in town, she came back to the flat with me. Pearson smiled inwardly. Poor Roy. It was always the same pattern, though he never seemed to realise it. Each affair was different to him, but to no one else. The eternal Don Juan, always seeking, always disappointed, because what he sought could be found only in the cradle or the grave, but never between the two. I guess you'll laugh at what knocked me out. It seems so trivial, though it frightened me more than anything that's ever happened in my life. I simply went over to the cocktail cabinet and poured out the drinks as I've done 100 times before. It wasn't until I'd handed one to Maud that I realized I had filled 3 glasses. The act was so perfectly natural that at first I didn't recognize what it meant. Then I looked wildly around the room to see where the other man was. Even then I knew somehow that it wasn't a man. But of course, he wasn't there. He was nowhere at all in the outside world. He was hiding deep down inside my own brain. The night was very still. The only sound a thin ribbon of music winding up from some cafe in the village below. The light of the rising moon sparkled on the sea. Overhead the arms of the crucifix were silhouetted against the darkness. Pearson waited, letting Connolly take his time. He seemed lucid and rational enough, however strange the story he was telling. The next thing I remember is lying in bed while Maud sponged my face. She was pretty frightened. I'd passed out and cut my forehead badly as I fell. There was a lot of blood around the place, but that didn't matter. The thing that really scared me was the thought that I'd gone crazy. That seems funny, now that I'm much more scared of being sane. He was still there when I woke up. He's been there ever since. Tell me, Jack, do you believe in telepathy? The abrupt challenge caught Pearson off his guard. I've never given it much thought, but the evidence seems rather convincing. Do you suggest that someone else is reading your mind? It's not as simple as that. What I'm telling you now, I've discovered slowly, usually when I've been dreaming or slightly drunk. You may say that that invalidates the evidence, but I don't think so. At first it was the only way I could break through the barrier that separates me from Omega. I'll tell you later why I've called him that. But now, there aren't any obstacles. I know he's there all the time, waiting for me to let down my guard. Night and day, drunk or sober, I'm conscious of his presence. At times like this, he's quiescent, watching me out of the corner of his eye. My only hope is that he'll grow tired of waiting and go in search of some other victim. Connolly's voice, calm until now, suddenly came near to breaking. Try and imagine the horror of that discovery. The effect of learning that every act, every thought or desire that flitted through your mind was being watched and shared by another being. It meant, of course, the end of all normal life for me. I had to leave Ruth, and I couldn't tell her why. Then, to make matters worse, Maud came chasing after me. She wouldn't leave me alone and bombarded me with letters and phone calls. It was hell. I couldn't fight both of them, so I ran away. And I thought that on Cyrene, of all places, he would find enough to interest him without bothering me.